In today's live event, we will hear from a panel of educators from GOA's network who will reflect on their experiences and answer your questions about how to assess for learning. As always, I want to begin by thanking you all for the incredible questions that you submitted. Before we jumped on this call, I was talking to the panelists, telling them how difficult it was to sort of synthesize and decide because there's so many different excellent questions that emerged. And so we're excited to spend some time today digging into some of these questions. The purpose of assessment is to gather relevant information about student learning. At times, though, we lose sight of this purpose or conflate assessment with other elements of our practice, including grading and reporting. And so how do we shift away from a mindset of using assessment as a way to just produce grades into a meaningful and empower learning experience for all students? Our panelists today will seek to tackle that question among many others as a way to identify how to better support students in their learning. Joining us today in the Zoom chat, we have Becky Green from GOA. She will be moderating the chat and collecting questions as they come in and also supplying resources as needed. And then on our panel today, we have Meg Griswold, who's a middle school humanities and journalism teacher at Graded, the American School of Sao Paulo. We have Kurt Prescott, who's GOA faculty and a humanities instructor and institutional research apprentice at Murray School in DC. And Elizabeth Rossini, who's the director of teaching and learning at the Nueva School. I want to start by asking you a little bit about kind of the state of assessment at your school and in your own practice. How has your approach or your school's approach to assessment shifted over time? What's driving those shifts? And really, what is the state of assessment at your school? And any of you can sort of start us off.
I can start if you want. As you said, I work at Graded, the American School of Sao Paulo, and I work in the middle school. So I'm going to speak about the middle school a little bit because we have some unique elements to us. When I arrived at Graded 4 years ago, we had a really strong policy about formative and summative assessments. Formative assessments were not counted in the final grade, only summative assessments. And that was a really strong divide and kind of a frustrating one, because what would happen would be students would say, is this formative or summative? And if I said formative, they were like, great. And then they wouldn't be as engaged. They wouldn't see it as mattering. And so there was almost the opposite. I want students to work really hard on the formatives, but yet they were kind of checking out. And so in the past couple of years, the middle school has made a shift to more of a competency-based assessment. But some of the spirit of that's been really transformative and really powerful has been the shift away from some things matter or some things don't, but that every time you show me your learning, I'm getting a picture and you are getting a picture of where you are in this journey. And so I'm always going to count every time I can learn something about your learning, I will. And I will communicate that to you and I will record that, right? I will make sure I capture that. The one that really got me interested in this change, I had a student who we did a formative and she scored really well. And then we did the summative and it was just an off day for her. And she was crushed that she did less well on the summative. It was as if somehow she hadn't shown her level of mastery very clearly on a previous attempt. And so I remember thinking it shouldn't feel like these are different things. So we moved towards this sort of everything matters, which maybe sounds very weighty. But where we are right now is whether it's small or it's big, show me what you know. I say that to students all the time. Does this count? Does this matter? Is this for a grade? And I say, I'm always watching you and I want to know what you know and what you can do. So take that seriously in that sense. So that's kind of where we are right now. And it's been a really powerful year with that shift fully in place. And with my current 7th grade students having never been part of the formative summative dichotomy. And I find that students feel like they always have a chance, like every day is a new chance to show me what they know. It's not just April 27th is the day, I better be ready. It's more every day is me and my teacher connecting on my learning, talking about seeing my learning. And I find that it's been really powerful, and students then see the value and really care about the little things and the big things, which has been really positive.
I can sort of build on that in part because I think that the school that I work at, Murray, is in some ways in a really similar place. And I don't know that it's been it's been all good. So I think to Meg's point, and I might add, so this is my first year teaching at Murray, and then prior to that, I was teaching at Andover up in Massachusetts. And I think that when I was at Phillips, I enjoyed a fair degree of autonomy over how I was thinking about assessment and feedback and grading in my individual classes, which had its benefits in terms of being able to innovate and try new things. But systemically, I also think presented some real challenges insofar as different teachers were doing different things in their classrooms, and then inequities would work their way in just with respect to like even the same sections of the same courses. Murray we use a team teaching approach to our core courses in 9th and 10th grade. And so the way that we assess is meant to be uniform across the board. And this year, the school made a pivot very similar to what Meg described, where we would no longer grade formative assessment and that only summative assessment would go into the grade book. And almost like to a T, students had the same sort of response, where especially in the fall, they wanted to know if it was formative. Informative to them meant that it didn't count. And so I think one of the things that for me, it really exposed, and I think sort of underscores the challenges of thinking about the difference between like formative assessments, which are meant to be really like feedback for learning, as opposed to summative assessments, which are feedback of learning. That like students didn't really understand the difference between that. I also think that there was a tacit assumption within the institution that there was already intrinsic motivation embedded into the ways that students related to our classes. And so when you took those external motivators out, like i.e. grades, particularly around things like homework or stuff that was more meant to be for practice, that motivation went away. And so I think that there's a couple like ways that one could respond to that. And I think in some respects, like one of the harder questions as educators to ask ourselves is, if our students are not engaged in learning without extrinsic motivators, I'm of the mindset that we need to take a hard look at what we're doing in our classes. And that can be really difficult if the curriculum that suddenly you have switched how you are assessing is something that you have taught for a very long time. And lo and behold, the kids that are showing up aren't willing to put in the time if it doesn't go into the book. So I think that the school is still trying to navigate this. And I don't think it has found the right sort of balancing act. I think one of the things that I'm aspiring for in my classes is to up the frequency of summative assessments, to really move away from what has, I think, become like a really high stakes opportunity at the end of the unit with lots of practice, instead shifting to more frequent lower stakes summative assessments. I might also add, I come from a coaching track and field background, and I find that frames so much of how I think about some of this, where you have practice every day and then you have a meet on the weekend and then you do it again the next week and you have a whole season, and you don't take like an average of your performances across the meet, and you don't like take one individual meet as the sort of benchmark of whether or not you can or can't do the thing. Our classes in a lot of ways aren't that different if we're talking about learning. I think the challenge comes like with grading, and I think it's really helpful to differentiate assessment from grading. They're not the same thing. We're assessing all the time. I think the question maybe that Meg is getting at, and then I'll pause and let Elizabeth sort of chime in, is like whether what we are assessing is representative of what our students learn, and that is so closely tied to the ways that they are or aren't engaging in our classes. And you can sort of follow that out into a whole different range of stuff. So I think that's about where I am, but I would love to hear Elizabeth sort of what this looks like at Nueva.
Yeah, building on what Meg and Kurt said, and I agree with Megan, a comment in the chat that, yeah, any assessment you're doing is formative, but sometimes you do it more formally than others, but they all can be used in a formative way. One of the things that Nueva is a school that we don't do grades until 10th grade. So we only have formal grades 10, 11, 12, and from pre-K through grade 9, we have narratives and different ways that we provide feedback. One of the things when I came to Nueva, I was it struck me from lots of feedback from teachers was, how do we make this process of recording and reporting less cumbersome? And how do we make it easier so that we can focus more on the feedback? And what I learned in those conversations across PK-12 was that we were spending a lot of our time during those formal opportunities to record and report and to share. And instead of having assessment be more like what Kurt and Meg were talking about, that it's just an integral part of learning, that it's two sides to this coin. You don't learn without assessment. You don't learn without feedback. And that it should be in close partnership with the students. And when I think of what we've been trying to do is we're trying to really look at what are some principles that go across all of our classes, all of our grades. And I'm just going to share some of them that come to mind. One would be, when we're assessing, use a body of evidence collected over time. So if you're using a unit structure, let's say a lot of people organize their curriculum into units, and you have a 6-week unit, what data are you collecting along the way to make the case? And what are you partnering with the students to make the case for learning and growth over time? And as Kurt said, not averaging it and saying, oh, your first attempt at something in week 2 that you're fixed there, but no, you're collecting this body of evidence. And what's important about that is the late Grant Wiggins always talked about, when you're assessing and then you're grading, you're making inferences about students and their learning, and be sure you have data to back that up. What a responsibility we have to make these inferences about our students, and we should have a body of evidence collected over time. Another key principle would be, make sure you're assessing knowledge and skill as well as understanding and transfer. We have a tendency to want to be looking at the content and the skills, but we need to be looking at how that can transfer outside. And so when you're looking at your body of evidence, design assessments that ask students to do something in a new or a novel way, so you can assess for understanding and transfer. Ensure that you are figuring out ways to have students partner in the assessment process, so that and that can be through frequent, informal and formal ways that you're assessing, but partner with them, ask them to reflect on that learning, because we want them to do the heavy lifting. We want them to be thinking about, here was what the goal was, here was my attempt at the goal, and here's my feedback on how I'm doing. And have your students partner with you in their goals that they're going to set to show their growth over time. And one of the things I remember as a young teacher, and it terrified me, but it also motivated me. A parent said, I just want to know you know my child. And I think that is so important. We need to know our learners as individuals as well as learners and how they grow. And assessment is a beautiful way for you to be checking along that cycle of learning throughout your unit to see how you know their learners, and partner with them in their reflection and their goal setting.
Thank you all so much. That's such a great start to this conversation. Elizabeth, I'm going to follow up a little bit with kind of what you said. You mentioned this idea of sort of having that body of evidence. When teachers are thinking about that evidence, what should that evidence look like, or what is the evidence that they're gathering, and kind of how does that sort of play into this process?
So that's a great question. And I have I started working, if anybody that is familiar with Understanding by Design, I started working with the authors of Understanding by Design when it was first published. And so I'm of that mindset. And one of the things when we talk about teachers are planning for a particular unit, and you're looking at your understandings and your broad questions at where you want them to be at the end of that chunk of learning. I'm just going to make this up, at the end of 6 weeks, right? So you're going to design assessments that show they've met those broad goals and they can transfer their learning and show understanding. And you're going to do more of a performance task, or a way that they can demonstrate their understanding. So that's one piece in your body of evidence, but you're also going to have those skill checks. You're also going to have those reflections. You're going to have those quizzes. You're going to have those ways, the dipsticking that you're doing. And so you want to be able to say, okay, in my skill checks, I gave students multiple opportunities to show how they were doing, and then we adjusted along the way. But I also gave them opportunities to show what they understand, and that can transfer to other settings. And that always, one of the things we've taught through Understanding by Design is that you always are going to have some kind of reflection, some opportunity for students to be able to say, here's where I'm going and here's how I think I'm doing. So reflection will be another part. So I would summarize that with skill checks, student reflections and goal setting, as well as assessments of understanding and transfer.
Could I lift up something that Elizabeth said that I think is
Please.
really important and could easily go unmissed. So I noticed, like, when you were talking about assessing for learning, you use the word infer, and I'm a big like advocate of that. But I think that, and feel free to build off of this if I'm like mischaracterizing it, but recognizing that there's a difference between inferring that learning has happened and directly measuring that learning has happened, that like learning itself is not something that you can directly measure. And so I think that, and Sarah, this might go back to your question a little bit, that underscores, I think, the importance of variability in your modes of assessment. Like, are you looking at it from different angles and also looking at it over time? In part to get reliable information. And so I think that that's something that's really easy to miss, is that we sort of can take a one-off opportunity as like sufficient evidence that a student has learned something. When like that, if it's not a direct measurement, you need more data in order to make that claim. And so I think that that's just, I noticed that you use that particular language and wanted to, again, lift that up for others in case it was something that went under the radar.
Yeah, I wanted to build a little bit. Oops, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Meg.
No, I was going to say one thing that's so becomes so normal that I forgot to mention is that it is graded policy at my school that we don't average grades. And so I want to echo what Kurt and Elizabeth said, that we don't average, it's where are you right now? And so if your evidence is showing you're moving forward, it's not an average. The thing you did in August isn't haunting you. But I love what you guys both said about this idea of returning to things. It's not a one-off. So we've been using competencies. We've sort of developed a list of skills we want. And I work in a team as well, 7th grade team. And we're like, oh, we only have one piece of data or two pieces of data on this competency. We have to return to that. And that's made us more aware of ways in which we are one-offing because we've categorized the skills or knowledge students are showing. So we're like, oh no, collaboration. We've only seen that once, or maybe some of us have done it 2 or 3 times. So it's made us really conscious of how maybe before we were doing one-offs, but we thought of it as, oh, well, we did one thing, but we're seeing where things might not be showing up. And we're really thinking about year-long competencies and how they are showing them in different ways. So if we're talking about argument and persuasion, we did speeches, but we also did an essay, and we're also doing, different types. So I think that frequency and the collection of data, more than 1 point, you need 2 points to make a line. And even that's really basic. You really need more than 2, and you need many chances, and students need to feel like they've been given a fair chance. In first semester, there was one competency that we only did once. It was public speaking. And at the end of the semester, students said to me, you only did one thing for that. And they said, I wanted another chance. And I felt really stuck with me that this particular student felt like she didn't have enough opportunities to show that she was growing from my feedback. So that's made us really conscious. We've slimmed down the number of things we're looking for. And we have tried to return to them in different ways so it doesn't feel repetitive. But I think that's so key. I really agree with that, Kurt.
Can I add on to that, Sarah? Or do you want to go to the next
No,
question?
go for it.
All right, a couple things I want to share. One, to build on what Meg was just talking about. When you're thinking about however you chunk your learning, let's say your year is a story, right? And each unit is a chapter, right? So you have these chapters that build on this story. Some of your learning goals or your learning outcomes are going to be specific to that chapter, and they're going to live in there, and you're going to be assessing them. But as Meg was saying, some of them are for the whole story, the entire year. And you need to be thinking about, if you're assessing for this chapter, this set of skills, this content, it should live within there. But if you're looking at something that's a year-long competency, when you're assessing a year-long competency in November, you're assessing students' approximation towards that in November. And so you have to be adjusting and recognizing that I can't expect them to master this in November, something that they have all year long. And so that's just another nuance when you're looking at unit specific that kind of live there and you're expecting them to own it, and then you're building on it versus something you're asking them to think about all year. And then stretch it even further if you're doing, PK-12 competencies and your competencies go this way, and you're asking for a pre-K student's approximation towards this learning outcome, and you're assessing, a 12th grader's approximation towards that as well. So that's one point I wanted to make. And one other one, an easy way to think about a body of evidence that we use in Understanding by Design is think of a photo, like a snapshot is one point in time. So you remember those old cameras and you take a picture and you pull, some of you might be too young for this, but you would take a picture and it would just print it out right there. That's one point in time. You have one set of data only. And when you're looking at a body of evidence, it's a photo album of opportunities. It's a photo album of assessment. So you're looking at multiple points over time. And when you're trying to decide for this story, for this chapter, for this unit, what pieces of evidence will help you make the best inferences, as Kurt was talking about.
I want to build off of something that I think popped up in the chat as well, but I know a lot of folks were wondering about this when they registered for this event as well, is, what does that mean for sort of the vehicles of assessment that we're using? And in particular, a lot of folks ask questions around tests and quizzes. How does that fit into assessing for learning? And really what kinds of, and I think Elizabeth, you touched on this, what kinds of assessments actually contribute to transfer? How do we actually design for that? And so I'll open it up really to any of you to tackle, but really, how do we start moving beyond tests and quizzes? Is there a way to design tests and quizzes so that they're promoting transfer? What does that all look like?
I think it's tricky. For a long time in my career, I've always been either an English or a humanities teacher. And there were many, many, many years of my teaching when I didn't give tests and quizzes. It's easy to do that in the humanities. It's a common practice. But there are times, though, when for some students, it's very hard to sustain their energy and attention over a 2-week writing process, if they're writing an essay, or a 1 week. And sometimes they're better under pressure in the moment. And so I've been thinking about, also, I read the book, Make It Stick, which I think has been really meaningful for me. And Kurt mentioned small, frequent, low stakes check-ins, a way is more importantly about for students to know what they don't know or what they do know. So I don't see quizzes as always bad. They are a useful tool. I've gotten away from quizzes that are more like fill in the blanks or repetitive. I try to use them few questions, but to ask students to actually do some, like, not transfer, but some thinking that's more narrative, even if it's a couple of sentences where they're showing me their thinking in a more elaborative way. And we use on our tests, we usually have a final question where students see something novel and they're asked to apply something, maybe it's a work of art or a photograph, and they're asked to say, what of the elements have we learned do you think would apply to this? What concepts, what knowledge do you see at play here? Even though you may not know what this image is, you're looking at it, show me that you can pull in and make those connections and transfer. So I see benefits. I try to balance those sort of in the moments, on the spot quizzes and tests, but I try to make them still meaningful. And I try to balance those. And that's not the only thing I do. I do things like I'll have students write a series of journal entries every day, every other day. And then I'll say, look back at all your journal entries and pick your best one. And I'm going to read that. And that's going to show me your best thinking. We do a lot of writing in the humanities, obviously. We do debates, both planned and kind of impromptu. I do written discussions. I think of many, many ways. We do Harkness discussions, and I do take notes and give feedback on those, which is, I know, a contentious issue. But I see tests and quizzes as having a lot of potential, but I try to use them very thoughtfully and not mindlessly. And I always tell students, these quizzes are for you to know what you know. And I hope that they always see improvement on the next task or the next quiz. And they use those quizzes as a personal check-in.
Yeah, I think similar to Meg, I also use quizzes as like a vehicle of formative assessment. It's usually like very low stakes retrieval practice. And the goal there is really thinking about moving isolated concepts from short into long-term memory. And so that's something that's done on the spot. They get the feedback right there. It's not graded. And I tell them that. I'm like, if you can't remember it, you can't remember it. That's okay. This is data for you. When I think about sort of assessments for like long-term learning, I think this is going to loop back to Elizabeth's point about designing for transfer. I think the things that I am often thinking about are authentic audience. How do we ensure that what we're asking our students to do is something that is transferable beyond just like the world of our classroom? And I think that depending on whatever it is we're looking at, there's lots of ways that you can sort of make those bridges. I've also, I think, really over the last couple of years have been really thinking about the role of student agency insofar as like how they are choosing to demonstrate their learning. And I think that there's ways that you can really scale that up or down depending on like what your capacity and bandwidth is at a given point in time. This can be giving students choice insofar as like the types of topics that they're choosing to explore. If you want to like ramp that up, it can be like what sorts of things they're being assessed on. I think that's harder as you depending on like what sort of context you're teaching in, like whether you're sort of accountable to other standards that limit your ability to sort of make those changes. But I think that there's a lot of good evidence that shows that when students have agency with respect to the ways that they're engaging in learning, that engagement is going to increase. I don't know. I guess beyond that, so like that tends to be how I like think about it. I think similar to Elizabeth, I also like do the work from the backwards designing sort of standpoint and really trying to think about how do I figure out where I want them to go and then go backwards from there. I know that, so this is like a link to GOA. I did some work designing the current religion and society course last summer. And one of the things that I really wanted to ensure was that there were recursive opportunities for students to have like transferable practice. So there's a course kind of competencies, and I described the course a little bit like an upward corkscrew where we kept coming back to the same things, but it was in a new context, a new lens. And the idea was that over time you would get better at these and you could see that trajectory like from start to finish. So I think those are the things that I think about, but I think the way that iterates really depends a lot on the class that you're teaching. But I think that sometimes teachers sort of take it upon themselves to be like the primary creative force when it comes to thinking about what assessment looks like. And the fact of the matter is like our students are often a lot more creative than we are. And so engaging them in terms of thinking about like what would be a meaningful way to demonstrate what you have learned in a particular like unit or discipline or whatnot, may yield surprising results. And I think you can start small with that. Like it doesn't have to be the whole unit. I mean, you can try it out on just like a given week. So.
Yeah, I think I would just add to those great nuggets from Meg and Kurt. When you're thinking about what kind of assessment to do, it's all going to come back to what data you're trying to gather. So if you want to understand how well students can work through a particular process or can use particular vocabulary or work through certain concepts, you're going to design your assessments accordingly. So if you need to do a skill check, do a skill check. You want to be what's the most valid and least disruptive way to get the feedback that you need. And so think about the kind of learning goals you're assessing. If it's a skill check, it's a content check, then design your assessment accordingly. If it's more around understanding and transfer, then design it accordingly as well. Kurt talked a little bit about kind of near transfer and far transfer. David Perkins talks about that. So if it's sort of near transfer, how well are they doing something right now in the moment? And can they kind of do this independently versus how well can they solve a really messy problem that's asking them to pull on all kinds of skills, right? So that's a little bit further. We often think about, we don't want to be assessing for students to understand something for 4 days or 4 weeks. We want to be thinking about 40 days, 40 months, 40 years. If we're doing our job well, we're preparing students for that far transfer.
Mm-hmm. That is so helpful. And Elizabeth, you touched on this a little bit, right? In terms of thinking about assessments, right? One side is like the design and what we are also sort of capturing as evidence, right? What do we know in terms of where students are, they're learning, but then there is this other piece around how do students know that they're learning? And that's kind of where some of the feedback comes into play. And so I want to ask, as we're thinking about feedback as the other side of the assessment coin, what kind of feedback sort of works best? What are some steps that we could take as teachers to make sure that the feedback process is both effective and sustainable, knowing that we all are mired in a myriad of different ways, wearing a lot of different hats? How do we really make sure that we're getting the most out of this feedback process to better serve our students?
Sorry, Kurt, you want to go? I think one of the most critical things that we can do as teachers is to partner with our students and to co-create and to develop student agency. And if we're clear about here's where we're going to be at the end of this chunk of learning, at the end of this chapter of our story for the year, right? At the end of these 6 weeks, we're going to be here. And it's my job to help you get there. And it's my job to help you, and with no ceiling, right? You might even go way beyond that. And so to be really clear about what your learning goals are, to be clear about at any given time what you're doing towards those goals. We're doing this for this reason. So, those students, and we all have them, they're like, why are we doing this? What, do we really need this? Those are amazing questions. And we should be so respectful of that question. And if we can't answer it, and to show that the value of their time and what they're doing is purposely designed towards those goals, then we should revisit what we've created. And I think we should, as both Kurt and Meg said, involve students in here's what I want you to show your learning about. Here's why I want you to show your growth. What ways do you want to partner with this? How can you show that? And I think one of the things around feedback, Grant Wiggins always talked about feedback. Obviously, he's was my mentor, but feedback is where learning occurs, right? So build in time to give feedback frequently. Have students give feedback to each other. Have students reflect and then set goals, and they're giving feedback to themselves. And then build in time for students to revisit work based on that feedback. And so one of the challenging things in the cadence of a year is having our assessment not feel like it's taking over. Assessment's just going to feel like a cool activity or a cool opportunity to confer. It doesn't have to feel high stakes and like it should feel like a gift. Feedback should be a gift as well. And be thinking about how you can regularly confer with students, give them feedback, and help them partner in their growth.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Elizabeth just said. I think for me, when I think about, Sarah, could you ask that question again? I want to make sure that I'm sort of speaking to the right parts of it, and then I'll share.
Yeah. Steps to ensure that the feedback process is both effective and sustainable.
Yeah. Okay. So there's so many thoughts. I think one of the things that I again would lift up from what Elizabeth said was like, feedback works best when it's frequent, when it's low stakes, when students have immediate opportunities to put it into practice, and when it's given in a manageable form. And the reason I sort of lift that up in particular is I think in independent schools, a lot of teachers really struggle with, I think, like the enduring myth of the self-sacrificing teacher, where one of the ways that you show that you really care about your job is just like doing so much. And I think like for humanities teachers, especially, one of the ways that I think we have been taught to demonstrate our care is to give like copious amounts of feedback, which the intention is there. And it is like one of the worst things that you can do when it comes to facilitating learning, in part because you're overloading students' working memory. They can't process that all at once. It tends to produce that much time. It tends to be fairly far removed from when students were actually doing that work. And then we don't always make sure that they apply those things after the fact. And so I think that really integrating feedback in a way that's going to facilitate learning does require some like pretty serious rethinking of at least like traditional ways of doing school. And this is where I alluded to my past experience as a track coach as like really influential in how I think about this. When I would coach long jump, kids would get immediate feedback right on the spot. I would focus on like one particular part of their jump, and then I'd tell them to go do it again, and I'd let them know if they got it right. And if they didn't, we would have a conversation. I'd ask them what's going on. And so it's this constant sort of process of like micro adjustments that build up over time. And I have really taken that approach to heart in terms of how I teach writing, where those really short conferences where I sit down and ask students to apply it while I'm right there so I can check to see if it's working. That is far more effective than writing like a massive narrative comment on a paper. And again, I think that intuitively we can understand that, but making that shift is a lot harder just because so much of our identities is wrapped up in that way of showing our care. And so I think it asks us to like kind of rethink like how we show that we care about our students in a classroom, how we build those relationships. I also think it requires like making sure that students really know like what they're doing. And I think maybe as the last piece I would add is like the importance of like very clear models. Again, I think one of the things that's great about track is like the end goal is super clear. Like you want to do an effective long jump. Like we can pull up YouTube videos and watch those. Like there's no cloaking about what it is that we're trying to do. I think that sometimes that's harder to articulate in the classroom. And I think for me, at least, goes back to the importance of making sure that that end goal is something that is like transferable and authentic, so that you can reach for those real world models as you start to think about how to guide students to that particular like skill or competency or whatever it is that you're striving for. If that's not there, I think that's where those why are we doing this sorts of questions come up. And if you can't answer those, then I think that's pointing to some deeper questions that might be worth interrogating about like what you're doing in your classroom and why. So anyway, I feel like there's so much more to say, but that's the stuff that I would highlight. And I'll drop in the chat. There's a book, Practice Perfect by Doug Levov, that is really, really great when it comes to just like short, actionable things that you can do in the classroom around feedback. The section in there is like, has been really helpful for me. And I would just to cite that came from some of Elena Aguilar's work around coaching, that she uses a lot of his ideas there. So just to cite my sources, but I'll drop a link to that in the chat for those that are interested.
I agree. This is the thing that's like bottomless. But I think there was a time, and I think in the parts of my career earlier on, that it's like the rubric ruled. If there isn't a rubric, it's not an assessment. And so there was this sense, and the rubrics got longer and longer and wider, and we just squeezed those margins and we added more boxes and rows. And I remember I got once as a teacher in a new school, a rubric in my mailbox after a classroom visit. And I stared at it and I couldn't process it. I just wasn't, but how did I do? What did you think of my class? Like, that's what I wanted to know. What did you like? What was interesting to you? What questions did you have? What do you think maybe were some opportunities I missed? I remember thinking, this isn't telling me anything about who I am as a teacher. And I remember thinking, oh my God, do students feel this way when they get a rubric? And so I think partially in the pandemic as well, thinking about beyond one thing that happened in the pandemic was the inability to look over a kid's shoulder, like those little coaching moments, and going, oh, I love what you've done here. What a cool opening sentence to that paragraph. Really good, right? That is the most meaningful, right? A rubric, I don't know if that communicates the same thing. And a rubric that comes 2 weeks after you've written the thing. And so I've thought a lot about Post-it notes and over the shoulders, right? Whether students are writing their goal on a Post-it note and then they turn it in at the end of the day, or I write it onto a Post-it note. Hey, those were awesome transition words, but let's think about more direct quotes. Stick it on their desk, and then they stick it on their folder. And it doesn't have to be this massive endeavor. Post-it notes. I used to leave so many Google comments, Google Doc comments. Sometimes one Google Doc comment is super powerful. Hey, I see some really strong paraphrase pieces of evidence. Do you have any direct quotes? Or, it'd be really great if you could tie this back to what you're trying to say in your speech. I'm not sure how this relates to your argument. Just one. And again, it's manageable. Okay, yeah, I can do that. And I'll say to them, apply this feedback to the other paragraphs. I've only looked at one paragraph. My other thing to make it manageable for me is when students come to me for a conference, they just, how good is it? What's the grade? And I say, pick one paragraph or one, whatever that means for that assignment, one page, one slide, one sentence. And let's talk about that, because hopefully you'll learn from that what you can then apply, because I want you to transfer this. I don't just want to catch all the things and then you just resolve all my comments. I want to teach you something in the first paragraph that then you can show me you've learned in the second and third paragraphs right away. So I think the Post-it note, whether it's students setting goals and me giving feedback, the over the shoulder, the checking, again, small bite-sized check-ins. I also have a really big clipboard and I write crazy, unintelligible little marks and comments, but I find that helps me sometimes to then follow up with the student and say, hey, you had great eye contact yesterday in your practice when I saw you working with your group. So that even if it's not right then, I've got data and I've got little notes, little nuggets. It doesn't have to be, oh, well, it wasn't on a rubric and I didn't circle a bunch of boxes and then write 7 or 8 sentences. There's so much power. I coach lower school swim team, and same thing, those little quick check-ins, and then a check-in the next day, because if I have that one-on-one meeting with a student at conference, that little nugget I gave them, hey, work on your transition words here. The next day, they might even say to me, how are they today? And I'll say, oh, they're great. And in that little moment, there's so much learning has happened and it's been so immediate, and they feel really connected to me and like I care about them and I'm watching them and I see them. And so I find that feedback is really powerful. Of course, there are rubrics. Of course, the boxes are circled. But I think some of those little small I can whip through 40 essays if I'm only looking at the first 4 sentences or something small and just leaving one comment. So I think that's been a big game changer for me.
Sarah, can I just share a couple strategies?
Yeah,
So
of course.
Touch on what Meg was saying. Someone shared it with me and they called it clipboard cruising. And basically just always have a clipboard with you or have it available. And Meg was talking about Post-it notes, but you could have big labels on it. And when you just notice a student, something's going on, or you're conferring with a student, or you've observed something over their shoulder, you can put the date and you can write that down and name it. And that label can get, put on a student's page in a notebook, wherever you need to do it. But those labels are super easy to put somewhere, that feedback. I know of a teacher in the lower school who does these in their students' kind of writing notebooks. They always save like 6 or 7 pages in the beginning, and they build these I can. It's just I can, and they'll be conferring with the student and notice that, wow, you're consistently using punctuation to aid the reader, and they'll write it and they'll date it in there and they'll put it and have a little celebration. And so there's that piece of feedback and that little celebration, and they're building this I can. Right. And you're looking at over the course of that year, you're seeing this I can build, and it's a beautiful way to show growth over time. And Kelly Gallagher is an author, English teacher in LA, and a literacy expert. And he came to my school years ago, and he talked about the volume of writing that his students are doing is more than he can get feedback on, and he can't manage it all. And so a strategy that he shared, and our high school teachers love this, was he would list on the board, here are the 7 kinds of writing or 7 things you're going to do over the next 2 weeks. And I am going to look at this one. And he would say, number 3, I'm going to look at that for everybody in the class. And I want to see how we're doing, and I need to check. I want you to identify another one of these 7 that you want me to check, and explain to me why you want me to check that. And so he's anchoring and he's deciding in the cadence of that unit, here's what I need to see how all the students are doing. But he wants to empower students to be a part of that process, set goals for themselves, and identify something on their own. So I thought those are strategies across all 3 divisions to share.
Delve into this challenge of like grades and assessments. I think on one level, the more I sort of recognize that I'm trying to unite to like systems that are irreconcilable. And I think the longer I do this, the more I feel like I am just ready to like throw everything out and just have students tell me what their grade is at the end of the term. So that said, I recognize that not all of us can do that, myself included. And I think that the first thing that is really important is centering relationships and recognizing that not all feedback needs to be quantified, and not all assessment needs to be quantified. And I think that when Meg was talking about getting that rubric in her mailbox, my reaction was like, how dehumanizing, impersonal. And I think like we haven't talked a ton about the relationship between equity and assessment in grades. And I think that that's a really good example of how centering those interpersonal connections can actually be a way of like undoing white supremacist cultural norms in our school that sort of demand that we quantify everything and objectify everything, and often at the expense of like the relationships we have with each other. And so I think that the more I sort of go down this rabbit hole, the more I really prioritize that first and foremost, and then try and deal with the other stuff. I think in my own practices, I think that there's a lot of policy shifts that I think I've just made over the years. Joe Feldman has definitely been influential in terms of like getting rid of late penalties, allowing revisions, cutting out grades that get at behavior. Like these are all things that we know are deeply inflected with bias and tend to adversely impact students of color. So when I think about grading and assessment and learning and equity, those are like really easy fixes that I think a lot of teachers can do. I think that systemically, if we're thinking about grades, I mean, I've taught in competency-based systems, standards-based systems, point systems, number systems, grade systems. Like I've seen them all. And again, I think that they all have their like deep limitations. And so I think that more than anything, it's important that students understand what information those are communicating, how they're determined, in making sure that there's opportunities for redemption. And I think that that gets back to this point about like one assessment is not enough to make a claim about whether or not learning has happened. You need to look at amalgamation of different things. And if a student can do it, they can do it. And so I think a lot about the role of redemption in grades, and how much that can do for students' motivation and how much it can kill motivation if it's not there. So I'll stop there and let Meg and Liz speak to the other parts of like how the grades fit in. But I think those are some things that are swirling around in my own mind.
We're in a moment of transition at Graded. So Graded's on a 1 to 7 scale to sort of mimic or mirror the IB, International Baccalaureate. So, and again, I've been in every system. You name it, I think I've been in it all. 65 to 100, A's, A to F, and now 1 to 7. And then the middle school moved, when we moved to competency-based learning, we as teachers wrote descriptors, beginning, approaching, meeting, extending, which I loved. I was part of the committee that got to work on those words. But I loved it because the students said, instead of saying, is it a 7, which is the constant question, is this a 7? What it used to be. Now it is it extending? And I will say, well, where have you extended? In what way have you gone beyond what I was expecting or what I was asking you to master or show me? And how have you extended? And then they go, oh, I don't know. And I'm like, well, there's a list here of some ways you might consider extending. And so the question was embedded within the what's my grade? And so they would sometimes say, is it meeting? And I'd say, well, what was I looking for you? What was I hoping you would have learned by now? And they're like, well, this, and this. I'm like, did you show me that you learned that or that you can do that? And then it really opened up the question. So I have to say, I do prefer that system, but we have a really big part of our community, both the parents and the board, who did not like that system for many reasons. And it wasn't what they knew. And so they've asked us to return to the 1 to 7 scale. This is very recent. And so that's been hard. Again, this is the reality, whether it's a school board or a city or a state, or just, whatever it is, you have a governing body that is above us, and, they are going to make those decisions for the school. So that decision has been made. And so we're going back to 1 to 7. And so it's tricky because what I don't like is, what does 6 mean? In the world, what does 6 mean? Whereas approaching, I know what that means. Like, well, I'm almost there. I'm not quite there. I'm not always there, but like I could say I'm approaching as a baker, or I'm approaching as a rollerblader, or whatever. But what's a 4 at any other life skill? What's a 6? What's a 2? So I think it's about explaining to students what the description of those is. If you use an A to F scale, or if you have numbers on a 100 scale, I think is exactly what Kurt said. They need to know what that means. And I always try to steer the conversation away from, am I like, is that my identity? It's so hard because they want it to be, I'm a 6, or I'm a 5, or I'm a B-, or I'm an A+, or whatever. And drive it back to, let's look at your work. Let's look at what you've shown me. Look at this amazing work or learning that you've demonstrated. This is amazing, but let's see where are you on the journey? So I try to draw the conversation away and not use it. I try not to use it when I'm giving feedback more formatively. I try not to say, oh, this is a whatever. And they often are like, but what is it? And I said, well, it's strong here and it needs work here. They hate me for it, but I just try to steer the conversation away. That's always going to be, no matter what school you're in, what country, and what place, you're going to have these external factors. But as much as you can try to contextualize and draw the conversation and make it meaningful and transferable to the real world, the better. But I don't really have a lot of great answers.
Yeah, I think I would just add to both Kurt and Meg, don't average, don't use zeros, look at most recent, most consistent, give students the benefits, give them multiple opportunities to show their learning, ensure that you're not just focusing on knowledge and skill. I was a terrible student. I'm surprised I'm in education. I was such a bad student, and I did not do well on these. And when I was growing up, all traditional assessments, you just basically learn something and you spit it back. And I thought until I was in my 30s that I wasn't smart. And I needed opportunities to show. I needed to be able to sit down and talk to someone. I needed to be able to write. I needed to be able to think out loud. And we want to catch students are doing well. And I know you're on this conversation in this because you believe that, right? We want to give students as many opportunities as possible to show how they're doing in their growth. We want to be honest about, here's where you started and here's where you are right now. Sometimes the growth isn't exactly where everybody needs to be, but it's still growth. Some of the challenges that we face is as Meg was saying, you're in places where you have to grade. Sometimes we're put in a box by the technology that we use, and it doesn't align with the pedagogy that we want from an assessment or perspective. But if you can go back to, Grant Wiggins always told me, when I was working at International School Bangkok, I was writing their K-12 assessment policy, and he was looking at it with other colleagues. But he said, focus on assessment and get assessment right. And if you can get assessment right, the grading will follow. If you collect a body of evidence and you can show and make really strong inferences about how your students are doing in partnership with them based on your body of evidence, you're going to be so much more comfortable with the score, the grade that you're having to record and report, right? And so if really think about, yes, Tom Gusky is another great thinker in this realm, Ken O'Connor, Jay McTighe. But if you can do some of those really important assessment practices and have really good assessment pedagogy or assessment in your pedagogy, the grading will be easier. It'll be more reflective of who students are, and you'll feel better about it.
I think, you mentioned one thing, Kurt, that I wanted to come back to, this idea. I'm going to throw it all out and just ask students to tell me what they think their grade should be. And in my student teaching, I worked at Satellite Academy in New York City. It's a transfer high school. So it's a high school for kids who have seen a lot of real life. They've either dropped out or failed out or been kicked out. A lot of them had children or had served in some prison time. But they were sort of reclaiming their lives. There was a lot of hope in them, but they really knew what was what in life. Like, they weren't going to put up with anything that was BS. And with their method of assessment that I got to do as a student teacher was, you sat down at a desk, they canceled classes for like 3 straight days, and you just scheduled kids for, I want to say, even maybe hour-long slots. They were super intense. And they had a folder, because this was kind of before Google Docs, and you would open the folder and you and the student would sit across the table and say, what should your grade be? And you would really slowly go through their work, and they would point out, I'm so proud of what I did here. This was really powerful for me. Look at my growth. Wow. I don't know what I was doing on this first one, but I can really see my progress. This was in an high school English classroom. And I remember feeling, every time I agreed with them, they never said, with maybe a few kind of, maybe they were feeling a little shy, that they felt bad, saying, I think I did really, really well, or they were being kind of too hard on themselves. But when you ask them, honestly, beyond just a number or a letter, how are you doing? What's the justification? What do you see in yourself? It's amazing what they say. I'm always worried they didn't see what I saw, but they do. Wow, they blow me away. And when I ask students, can you self-assess after a Harkness discussion, something small, a 15-minute discussion, they will write the most thoughtful things about themselves. It was really hard for me at the beginning, but then I really felt like I got into a groove with this, not raising my hand. And I would think that's exactly what I saw too. So I think we have to ask them more. It's scary and it's vulnerable for us. It's vulnerable for them. I think our worry is that they're going to argue with us or they're going to be upset or angry. But I just find that every time I ask students, and they really have to talk about it, not just give me a number or a letter or a grade or a word, they are thoughtful and they will reflect. So I think it seems simple, but I think there's a lot of power to that. And if a school especially adopts that as a system, that this is happening across all disciplines, across all teachers, I think it can be really transformative for students and for teachers, and be, again, a moment of relationship, right? That assessment as relationship, as connection, as that real human bond that students feel with us, that they have an advocate and an ally in their corner, as opposed to a person from above.